Doctor adjusted the neural interface headset with his four-fingered hands, his scaled skin reflecting the pale blue light of the laboratory monitors. The scientist had spent 3 cycles preparing for this moment, and his excitement was barely contained within his serpentine frame. Behind him, a dozen other researchers from various species watched through the observation window, their alien features twisted with anticipation. The human subject lay unconscious on the examination table, breathing steadily through the oxygen mask. The specimen had been acquired from a frontier colony world during what the Galactic Council officially termed a resource acquisition operation. To the humans, it had been a massacre. This particular human, designated Subject 7 Alpha, had been one of the few survivors found hiding in the ruins of New Eden Colony. "Begin Phase 1 neural mapping," commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had dissected fear from 100 different species. They had built their reputation as the galaxy's premier experts on, particularly the study of terror responses across different sentient species. Every spacefaring civilization had contracted their services at one point or another. The neural scanner hummed to life, sending invisible tendrils of energy through the human's brain tissue. Data began flowing across the holographic displays, painting a 3-dimensional map of neural pathways that pulsed with different colors representing various emotional and cognitive functions. "Fascinating," whispered Dr. X, whose compound eyes could process the data streams simultaneously. "Look at the amygdala complexity. It's far more developed than our previous subjects." Nodded, his forked tongue flicking out to taste the air. "The preliminary scans from the colony suggested as much. Humans appear to have evolved an unusually sophisticated fear response system. Not just the basic fight-or-flight mechanisms we see in most species, but layered psychological defense networks." The humans stirred slightly and increased the sedative flow. They needed the subject conscious but compliant for the real experiments to begin. They had perfected techniques for inducing specific types of terror while keeping subjects alive and responsive for extended periods. "Subject's neural activity is stabilizing at optimal levels," reported Dr. Law, a gelatinous whose translucent body housed a distributed nervous system that made her ideal for monitoring complex brain patterns. "Ready to initiate controlled fear stimulation." The first test was simple visual horror, images projected directly into the subject's optical cortex. The team had compiled a database of terrifying imagery from across the galaxy, things that had reduced hardened soldiers of a dozen species to gibbering wrecks. Images of cosmic entities, existential voids, reality-warping phenomena, and predators that existed only in nightmares. The human's brain lit up like a festival display. Neural pathways flared with activity, but instead of the expected breakdown, something remarkable happened. New connections began forming in real time, as if the brain was actively adapting to process the horror more efficiently. "Impossible," breathed. "The neural plasticity rates are off the charts. It's not just processing the fear, it's learning from it." Subject 7 Alpha's eyes snapped open, pupils dilated but focused. Despite the terrifying images flooding his visual cortex, he spoke in a calm, measured voice. "Are you the ones who killed my family?" The question caught the research team off guard. Most subjects at this stage were either catatonic or screaming. Dr. X's antennae twitched nervously. The subject shouldn't be capable of coherent speech under this level of stimulation. Increased the intensity, adding auditory components designed to trigger primal fears of being hunted. The sound of approaching predators, the whisper of wind through dead forests, the echo of footsteps in empty corridors. The human's vitals spiked, but his expression remained eerily calm. "My name is," the human continued, his voice carrying an edge that made several of the observers step back from the window. "I was a teacher on New Eden. I taught children about the wonders of the universe, about how vast and beautiful it could be. Would you like to know what I learned when you monsters came to my world?" "Increase sedation," ordered, but Dr. Law's readings showed something alarming. "The sedatives aren't taking effect. His metabolism is somehow neutralizing them faster than we can administer them." Turned his head to look directly at, despite the restraints that should have prevented such movement. "I learned that some things in this beautiful universe are genuinely evil, and I learned what happens to humans when everything we love is taken away." The neural displays were showing patterns unlike anything in the database. Instead of breaking down under terror, The human brain was reorganizing itself, creating new structures that seemed to feed on the fear and transform it into something else entirely. Phase 2, decided, his scientific curiosity overriding his growing unease. Direct neural implantation of terror constructs. This was their masterpiece, artificial fear patterns that bypassed natural psychological defenses and induced pure, concentrated horror at the cellular level. They had used these constructs to break the will of entire species during the Council's expansion campaigns. The implantation began, and for a moment screamed. It was a sound that echoed through the laboratory like the cry of a dying star, filled with such anguish that 2 junior researchers fainted. But then, impossibly, the screaming stopped and began to laugh. It wasn't the laughter of madness. It was worse. It was the laughter of someone who had looked into the abyss and found it wanting. "Your constructs," said, his voice now carrying harmonics that shouldn't have been possible with human vocal cords. "They're afraid." Doctor felt his scales prickle with an emotion he hadn't experienced since his species had evolved past their prey animal ancestors. "What do you mean?" "I can feel them," continued, his eyes now reflecting light in ways that human eyes shouldn't. "Your little terror constructs. They're not just patterns of fear, they're alive in their own way, and they're terrified of what they've found in my mind." The neural displays began showing impossible readings. The terror constructs, designed to overwhelm and dominate, were being absorbed and transformed. Worse, they were sending distress signals back through the neural link to the main computer systems. "Sir," Dr. La's voice trembled through her universal translator. "The constructs are attempting to retreat. They're trying to withdraw from the subject's mind." Sat up on the examination table, the restraints falling away as if they were made of paper. The movement was fluid, wrong somehow, as if he was operating under different physical laws than the rest of reality. "You want to study human fear?" asked, and now his voice was coming from multiple directions at once. "Let me show you what we're really afraid of." The laboratory lights began to flicker, and shadows started moving in ways that the laws of physics. In those shadows, the research team glimpsed things that their minds rejected, impossible geometries and predatory shapes that seemed to exist in too many dimensions simultaneously. "We're not afraid of death," continued, his form beginning to blur at the edges. "We're not afraid of pain or loss or even extinction. Those are just experiences, and humans have always been good at adapting to new experiences." Dr. X was backing toward the exit, her compound eyes struggling to process what she was seeing. "What are you saying?" Smiled, and his smile was the most terrifying thing any of them had ever seen. "We're afraid of what we might become, what we might do when everything else is taken away, what we might choose to be when the universe shows us that cruelty is the natural order of things." The shadows in the laboratory began to take shape, forming into things that resembled humans but moved like predators. They weren't hostile exactly, but they radiated an aura of potential violence that made every instinct scream warnings. "You see," explained, his voice now echoing from everywhere and nowhere, "you made a fundamental error in your research. You assumed that fear was a weakness to be exploited. But human fear isn't weakness. It's a warning system. It's our mind's way of telling us that something needs to be destroyed before it can hurt us again." Doctor tried to activate the emergency containment protocols, but the controls wouldn't respond to his touch. The metal seemed to recoil from his scaled fingers as if it had developed its own sense of revulsion. "Your species has been studying terror for so long," observed, his head tilting at an angle that should have broken his neck. "But you never learned the most important lesson about fear. It's not about what's being afraid. It's about what the afraid thing might do to make the fear stop." The laboratory's walls began to weep a substance that looked like blood, but smelled like ozone and despair. The research equipment was functioning perfectly, continuing to record data even as it began to melt and reshape itself into forms that served no known scientific purpose. "Please," Dr. La whispered, her gelatinous form trembling. "We didn't know. We were just following orders." Looked at her with something that might have been pity if it hadn't been so terrible. "Orders? Yes, I understand orders. I followed them too once upon a time. I taught children to be curious about the universe, to explore, to question, to dream of the wonders they might find among the stars." He stood up fully now, and his shadow fell across all of them simultaneously, despite the fact that there was only one of him and they were scattered throughout the room. But you know what I learned when you acquired resources from my world? When you turned my children into screaming meat for your experiments? I learned that some questions have answers that break the questioner, and some dreams become nightmares that refuse to end even after you wake up. The air in the laboratory began to thicken, becoming viscous like liquid terror. The researchers found themselves moving slowly, as if trapped in amber made of crystallized fear. "So here's what's going to happen," announced, his voice now harmonizing with frequencies that human vocal cords couldn't produce. "You wanted to understand human terror. You're going to get a comprehensive education." Doctor managed to croak out a question. "What do you want?" Considered this for a long moment, his head tilting first one way and then another in movements that seemed to trace impossible angles through space. "Want," he repeated, and the words seemed to echo through dimensions that the laboratory shouldn't have had access to. "I want my students back. I want my world back. I want the universe to be the beautiful, wondrous place I taught them it could be." He paused and his smile returned, wider than human anatomy should have allowed. "But since that's impossible, I'll settle for making sure that the things responsible for taking it away learn what real terror feels like." The research equipment began to sing, electronic voices harmonizing in frequencies that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to the primitive brain centers responsible for processing existential dread. The song was beautiful and terrible and completely inhuman, despite being performed by machines designed by organic minds. "The wonderful thing about human fear," continued conversationally, "is that it's not just an emotion, it's a creative force. When a human is truly afraid, we don't just react. We imagine, we extrapolate, we consider every possible worst-case scenario, and then we prepare for the ones that are even worse than that." The laboratory was transforming around them, walls flowing like liquid while maintaining their structural integrity. The space was becoming larger inside than outside, filled with corridors that led to places that couldn't exist within the station's blueprints. "And the beautiful thing about human imagination," added, his form now flickering between different versions of himself, some of which appeared to be made of shadow and starlight, "is that it can make anything real if you're frightened enough to believe in it." Dr. X tried to speak, but found that her translator couldn't process whatever language she was thinking in. The words in her mind had become alien to her own species' communication patterns. "You see," explained, apparently responding to her unvoiced thoughts, "you've accidentally created something that your own science said was impossible. You've made fear into a communicable condition, but not the kind of fear you were studying. This is the fear of a species that learned to domesticate nightmares." The shadows in the transformed laboratory began to move with purpose, forming shapes that suggested rather than displayed the tools of some cosmic surgery. They weren't threatening, exactly, but they conveyed the impression of mechanisms designed to perform procedures on concepts rather than matter. "We're going to start with basic empathy training," announced cheerfully, his voice now coming from sources that included some of the research equipment itself. "You're going to experience the fear felt by every species you've experimented on in chronological order. Then we'll move on to the advanced curriculum." Doctor found his voice long enough to ask, "What's the advanced curriculum?" Turned to look at him, and for a moment his expression was almost kind, almost human. "You're going to learn what human children are afraid of," he said softly. "You're going to understand the terror of a 10-year-old who watches monsters kill her parents, the fear of a 7-year-old boy who hides under a bed while his world burns, the absolute despair of a teacher who realizes he can't protect the children who trusted him to keep them safe." The laboratory had finished its transformation, becoming something that existed partially in normal space and partially in the realm of pure concept. The researchers found themselves standing in a place that was simultaneously a sterile scientific facility and a child's bedroom and a burning schoolhouse, and the space between stars where screams could echo forever. "And then," continued, his multiple voices creating harmonies that rewrote local physics with their resonance, "if you survive the basic education, we'll explore the really interesting question." Dr. Law, her form now trembling so violently that her molecular cohesion was becoming questionable, managed to ask, "What question?" Smiled with teeth that were simultaneously too sharp and too numerous, and not there at all. "What happens when something that learns to weaponize its own terror decides to teach that skill to the rest of the universe?" The lesson began, and the screaming started immediately. But it wasn't the researchers who were screaming, not at first. It was the sound of every fear they had ever induced in others, compressed into a single moment of perfect understanding. And somewhere in the space between the scream and the silence that followed, began to teach his final class about the wonders of the universe, and why some wonders should never have been discovered. The Galactic Council emergency session was called to order in what had once been the most secure chamber in known space. Representatives from 47 different species sat in their designated atmospheric zones, each breathing their preferred gas mixture while trying to process the impossible reports flowing in from across the sector. Admiral of the Imperial Navy stood at the central podium, his usually pristine scales dulled with the gray pallor of extreme stress. Behind him, holographic displays showed the last known communications from Research Station Omega-7, though the term communications was being generous. "Honored counselors," began, his voice carrying none of the usual arrogance, "what you are about to see represents a fundamental threat to galactic civilization as we know it." He activated the first recording, and the chamber filled with the sound of Doctor's final transmission. The video showed the laboratory, but something was wrong with the perspective. The camera seemed to be recording from multiple angles simultaneously, showing the same space from viewpoints that couldn't physically coexist. "Day 7 of the anomaly," Kame's voice, though his image flickered between showing him speaking and showing him screaming silently. "The human subject has achieved some form of controlled reality manipulation. We can no longer distinguish between what we are observing and what we are being forced to experience." The image shifted, showing standing in the center of the laboratory. He appeared perfectly normal and completely human, except for the fact that his reflection in the metal surfaces showed something else entirely. In the reflections, he was simultaneously a teacher reading to children, a man watching his world burn, and something that existed in too many dimensions for the recording equipment to properly capture. "The fear constructs we implanted," his voice continued. "They haven't just been absorbed, they've been recruited. They're working with the subject now, helping him understand our research methods from the inside." Counselor of the Crystalline Hegemony raised a limb that sparkled with inner light. "Admiral, surely this is some form of technological deception. Humans are a primitive species with no known psionic capabilities." His expression would have been pitying if he hadn't been so terrified. "That was our assumption as well, Counselor. We were wrong." The next recording showed Dr. X attempting to document what she was experiencing. Her compound eyes were reflecting images that weren't in the room, showing scenes of devastation from worlds that hadn't been attacked yet. "The subject claims to be conducting educational sessions," she reported, her usually precise scientific vocabulary degrading into increasingly frantic descriptions. "But these aren't normal learning experiences. We're not just being shown information. We're being made to understand it with perfect, absolute clarity." Her image focused on something off-camera, and her antennae began to tremble. "He's teaching us what it felt like to be the children on New Eden Colony, what it was like to hide while monsters hunted them. But it's not just memory implantation. We're experiencing it as if it's happening now, as if it's always been happening, as if it's the only thing that has ever happened." The transmission cut to static, then resumed showing the laboratory from an impossible overhead view. Was sitting at what had been an examination table, now somehow transformed into a teacher's desk. The research equipment had arranged itself into rows like school desks, and the various alien scientists sat at them with expressions of rapt, horrified attention. "Today's lesson is about proportional response." His voice came clearly through the recording, though his mouth didn't appear to be moving. "When someone hurts your family, how do you make sure they understand why that was a mistake?" Dr. Law raised what might have been a tentacle, her gelatinous form trembling with effort. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that suggested she was crying, though her species had no tear ducts. "Please, we understand now. We know what we did wrong, can't you just kill us?" Smiled, and the smile was infinitely patient and completely terrifying. "Death is too easy. Death is what you gave my students. They don't get to learn any more lessons, but you get to keep learning forever." The recording shifted again, showing the same laboratory from multiple time periods simultaneously. In some views, it was the sterile research facility it had been built as. In others, it was a classroom decorated with children's artwork. In still others, it was a burning ruin filled with small bodies and the echo of laughter that had been cut short. You see, continued, addressing his captive audience of galactic scientists, the interesting thing about human education philosophy is that we believe learning should be experiential. You don't just read about history, you try to understand what it felt like to live through it. He gestured, and the laboratory walls became transparent, showing views of space that shouldn't have been visible from their location deep within the research station. But these weren't normal star patterns. Each point of light was a world, and the watchers could somehow perceive the suffering taking place on each one. So for today's assignment, you're going to experience the historical context of your research. Every species you've experimented on, every world you've acquired resources from, every individual mind you've broken in the name of science. Doctor tried to activate an emergency beacon, but the device transformed in his hands, becoming something that looked like a child's toy but broadcast signals that shouldn't have been possible with their technology. "Help is coming," he whispered into the device. "Tell them to stay away. Tell them the humans aren't what we thought they were. Tell them fear isn't a weapon you use on humans, it's a tool they use to reshape reality." The recording showed nodding approvingly. "Very good. That's the first lesson many species never learn. Fear for humans is a creative medium. We're artists of anxiety, sculptors of dread, composers of cosmic horror." The view shifted again, showing the laboratory as it now existed in multiple realities simultaneously. In one layer of reality, it was still a functional research station. In another, it was a school where alien children learned to read human fairy tales. In a third, it was a surgical theater where concepts themselves were being dissected and examined. "The beautiful thing about human fear," continued, his voice now echoing from sources that included the station's hull plating and the quantum vacuum itself, "is that it's not just personal. We're social creatures. We share our fears, build on them, make them bigger and more terrible than any individual mind could conceive." The recording equipment began to malfunction, showing impossible colors and shapes that the display screens shouldn't have been able to render. Through the visual distortion, the watchers could see that the laboratory was expanding, growing beyond the physical constraints of the station. "And the most beautiful thing of all," added, his form now flickering between being a mild-mannered teacher and being something that existed in the spaces between thoughts, "is that human fear is communicable. We can teach other species to be afraid the way we're afraid. We can share the gift of imagination-powered terror." Dr. X stood up from her makeshift desk, her compound eyes now reflecting realities that the other researchers couldn't see. When she spoke, her voice carried the cadence of someone reciting a lesson learned through perfect, terrible understanding. "The human fear response isn't defensive," she said, each word carefully enunciated as if she was afraid of forgetting the pronunciation. "It's a tool for reality modification. When humans are sufficiently frightened, they don't just react to threats, they imagine new threats that are worse than the original problem, and then they make those imaginary threats real as a form of psychological preparation." Applauded, the sound echoing through dimensions that the research station wasn't supposed to have access to. "Excellent! You're beginning to understand the curriculum." The recording showed him walking between the rows of alien scientists, now all sitting attentively at desks that had definitely not existed in the original laboratory. As he moved, his shadow fell across each of them, and wherever the shadow touched, their expressions changed to reflect new levels of comprehension. "Now," he announced, returning to the front of his impossible classroom, "who can tell me what happens when a species that weaponizes imagination encounters a galactic civilization that relies on predictable psychological responses?" Dr. Law raised her appendage again, her gelatinous form now exhibiting patterns of bioluminescence that spelled out words in languages her species had never developed. "The civilization discovers that all their strategies are based on incorrect assumptions," she recited. "They learn that some species don't break under pressure, they become something new, something that uses the pressure as raw material for transformation." Nodded approvingly, "And what do we call this transformation process?" The entire class answered in unison, their voices harmonizing in ways that their different species' vocal apparatus shouldn't have allowed. "Evolution through terror." The recording static increased, and through the interference, Admiral could see that the laboratory was no longer contained within the research station. The space had somehow extended itself into the surrounding sectors of space, creating a classroom that existed partially in normal reality and partially in the shared nightmares of everyone who had ever heard the story. Today's homework assignment, announced cheerfully, is to spread what you've learned. Share the new understanding with your respective species. Teach them about the difference between fear as a response and fear as a creative tool. The alien scientists began to stand, moving with the purposeful behavior of students who had been given a clear assignment. But their movements were wrong, too fluid, as if they were operating under physical laws that had been rewritten by someone with a very different understanding of how reality should work. "Wait," Doctor called out, his voice carrying a note of desperate hope. "What happens to us afterward, when the lesson is complete?" Turned to look at him, and for a moment his expression was almost human again, almost kind. "That depends," he said softly, "on how well you learn and how effectively you teach others." The recording showed him walking toward what had been the laboratory's exit, but was now something that looked like a school doorway leading into star-filled space. "You see," he continued, his voice fatting as he moved away from the recording equipment, "this was never about revenge. Revenge is what you do when you want to hurt someone. This is education. This is me sharing what I learned when your people taught me what the universe really looks like." The alien scientists filed out after him, their forms flickering between their normal appearances and something else entirely. As they passed through the doorway, each one paused to look back at the camera with expressions that conveyed perfect understanding of something that the recording equipment couldn't capture. The last image showed the laboratory returning to its normal appearance, sterile and functional and completely empty. But the recording equipment continued to function, capturing the space for another 17 hours. And during those hours, if the viewers looked carefully, they could see things moving in the corners of the frame. Shadows that fell in the wrong directions. Reflections that showed different rooms entirely. Children's laughter echoing from sources that weren't there. Admiral paused the recording and looked out at the assembled council members. Many of them were exhibiting species-specific signs of extreme distress. "This transmission was received 6 standard days ago," he reported. "Since then, we have lost contact with Research Station Omega-7 and the entire surrounding sector. Our scouts report that the space itself has become unreliable. Navigation equipment functions normally until ships get within 10 light-years of the station's last known position. Then instruments begin showing readings that contradict physical law." Counselor's crystalline structure was flickering with colors that indicated deep unease. "What about the research team? Any survivors?" Activated another display showing scattered reports from across the galaxy. "That's what makes this a council-level emergency. The research team is surviving, all of them. They've been spotted on dozens of different worlds, apparently conducting their own research now." The new recording showed Dr. X standing in what appeared to be a university lecture hall on the... She was addressing an audience of her own species, but her manner of speaking had changed completely. Her voice carried harmonics that made her audience lean forward with rapt attention. "Today we're going to discuss advanced fear theory," she was saying, her compound eyes reflecting lights that weren't in the lecture hall. "Specifically, the difference between being afraid and teaching others to be afraid in more effective ways." Behind her, diagrams appeared on the presentation screen showing neural pathway modifications that would allow non-human brains to process terror the way human brains did. The math was correct, the brain chemistry was sound, and the implications were absolutely horrifying. "Dr. X has been giving similar lectures across the education system," Admiral reported. "Dr. La has been conducting workshops for scientists on experiential empathy enhancement." Doctor was spotted yesterday in the capital, apparently recruiting volunteers for something he calls reality modification experiments. The council chamber fell silent, except for the ambient sounds of various life support systems, struggling to process the emotional atmosphere. Finally, Counselor of the Hive Collective spoke, her multiple voices creating harmony that usually conveyed wisdom and authority. Now they just sounded very, very tired. "Admiral, what are your recommendations for containment?" Looked at her for a long moment, his expression suggesting that he had hoped no one would ask that question. "Counselor," he said carefully, "I'm not sure containment is possible. The humans appear to have developed a form of psychological warfare that operates by teaching the target population to think like humans. And humans, as we are learning, think in ways that can rewrite the basic assumptions underlying galactic civilization. He activated a final display, showing a star map with spreading zones marked in red. These are the sectors where we've confirmed presence of graduated researchers conducting educational outreach. The pattern suggests exponential growth. The red zones covered nearly a third of council space, and the expansion rate was accelerating. How long, Counselor asked, before the educational campaign reaches critical saturation? Admiral consulted his data pad, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer. At current rates, approximately 30 standard days until every major population center in council space has been exposed to the new curriculum. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of 47 different species, simultaneously discovering what it meant to be afraid in the way that humans were afraid. And somewhere in the space between stars, smiled and prepared his next lesson plan. The emergency fleet assembled at the edge of council space was the largest military force ever gathered in galactic history. 2,000 warships representing every major species, armed with weapons capable of sterilizing entire star systems. Admiral stood on the command bridge of the flagship, watching long-range sensors track the approaching anomaly. What had once been Research Station Omega-7 was no longer recognizable as a space station. The structure had grown, spreading across multiple light-years in patterns that both engineering principles and physics. It resembled nothing so much as a vast university campus built from crystallized space-time, with corridors that led between dimensions and lecture halls that could accommodate audiences from across the galaxy. "Sir," reported Lieutenant Vexesha, her young features pale with stress, "we're receiving a transmission from the anomaly. It's an invitation." The main screen activated, showing standing in what appeared to be a simple classroom. Behind him, a blackboard displayed equations that described the relationship between imagination and reality in terms that made the fleet's best scientists weep just looking at them. "Hello," said, his voice carrying clearly across the impossible distance. "I understand you're here for the final examination. Please form an orderly line and enter through the main auditorium. Don't worry about your ships, they'll be perfectly safe in the parking dimension." Admiral felt his scales ripple with the equivalent of a nervous laugh. Parking dimension. The space around the fleet began to shimmer, and suddenly they found their ships floating in a vast hangar that extended in directions that shouldn't exist. The walls were lined with what appeared to be student artwork, crayon drawings of alien species holding hands under rainbow skis. The cheerful innocence of the images was somehow more terrifying than any weapon. "All personnel are invited to attend the graduation ceremony," continued, his image now appearing on screens throughout the entire fleet. "Attendance is mandatory, but don't worry. The curriculum has been specifically designed to ensure that everyone passes." Throughout the assembled ships, soldiers and officers found themselves standing up from their stations and walking toward airlocks that opened into corridors filled with soft, warm light. The movement wasn't forced exactly, but it carried the inevitability of a student walking to class when the bell rings. Admiral tried to resist, but found himself genuinely curious about what was planning to teach. The curiosity felt natural, like his own emotion, but it was accompanied by the strange certainty that he was experiencing someone else's idea of what curiosity should feel like. The corridors led to a vast amphitheater that could seat millions of beings while somehow maintaining the intimate atmosphere of a small classroom. Every member of the council fleet found a seat perfectly suited to their species' anatomy, with their preferred atmospheric composition and gravity level. Stood at the center of the space, still looking like nothing more threatening than a mild-mannered teacher. But around him, the air shimmered with the presence of his original students, the research team from Omega-7. They had changed, becoming something that existed partially in normal space and partially in the realm of pure concept. "Welcome to your graduation ceremony," announced, his voice reaching every member of the audience with perfect clarity. "Today marks the end of your species' education in traditional galactic civilization and the beginning of your advanced studies in applied human philosophy." Doctor stepped forward, his serpentine form now flickering between solid matter and mathematical equation. When he spoke, his voice harmonized with frequencies that rewritten local physics. "The final examination consists of a single question," he announced. How do you restructure galactic society to ensure that what happened to the human colony worlds never happens again? Admiral found himself raising his hand, the gesture feeling as natural as if he had been a student all his life. We could implement stronger protective protocols for primitive species. Shook his head sadly. That's a failing grade, Admiral. You're still thinking like the people who created the problem in the first place. Try again. Counselor's crystalline form pulsed with confused light patterns. We could establish autonomous zones where developing species could evolve without interference. Better, Dr. X said, her compound eyes now reflecting patterns that showed possible futures. But still missing the fundamental lesson. What is the actual problem that needs to be solved? The vast audience sat in thoughtful silence, millions of beings from across the galaxy struggling with a question that seemed simple, but revealed depths of complexity the more they considered it. Finally, a young engineer near the back raised her antenna. The problem isn't our treatment of primitive species. The problem is that we think in terms of primitive and advanced species at all. Smiled, and his expression radiated the pure joy of a teacher whose student has grasped a difficult concept. Excellent, please elaborate. The engineer stood up, her voice carrying clearly across the vast space. Every species develops unique approaches to existence. When we classify some as primitive and others as advanced, we're applying a single measurement scale to phenomena that can't be meaningfully compared. And what does that mean for galactic civilization? Dr. La asked, her gelatinous form now exhibiting bioluminescent patterns that conveyed complex emotional mathematics. It means, the engineer continued, her confidence growing, that we've been conducting civilization incorrectly from the beginning. We've been trying to create uniformity instead of fostering diversity. We've been treating difference as something to be corrected rather than something to be celebrated. The audience began to murmur, thousands of conversations starting simultaneously as beings processed this fundamental shift in perspective. Waited patiently for the discussion to develop, occasionally nodding encouragement or gesturing for someone to continue a particularly interesting line of thought. But, Admiral interjected, how do we maintain order? How do we prevent conflicts between species with incompatible worldviews? Turned to look at him, and his expression was infinitely patient. Admiral, how do humans handle diversity within their own species? Considered this, his people had studied human civilization before the conquest of their worlds. They create systems that allow different groups to coexist while maintaining their distinct identities. And when conflicts arise, they negotiate, they compromise, they find ways for different approaches to work together. Paused as the implications hit him. But that would require treating every species as equals. Yes, said simply. It would require abandoning the assumption that there is a single correct way to be intelligent, a single proper path of development, a single valid approach to existence. Doctor moved to a presentation screen that materialized out of the auditorium's architecture. Let's examine the practical implications. If we restructure the Galactic Council as a forum for cooperation between equals rather than a hierarchy of advancement levels, what changes? The screen showed projections of galactic civilization reorganized along completely different principles. Instead of core worlds ruling over colonies, there were networks of interconnected communities, each contributing their unique capabilities to collective projects while maintaining their individual characteristics. Resource acquisition operations become trade negotiations, Dr. X added, her voice carrying harmonics that made the concepts feel obviously correct. Research becomes collaborative exploration. Conquest becomes invitation to join a growing community of diverse perspectives. The audience watched as the projections showed worlds that had been strip-mined for resources transformed into thriving centers of unique culture. Species that had been enslaved or eliminated were shown rebuilding and developing their own approaches to space travel and scientific advancement. But the most important change, continued, walking through the aisles of the vast auditorium, is psychological. When you stop thinking of other species as primitive versions of yourselves, you become capable of learning from them. And when every contact with a new species becomes an opportunity to discover new ways of thinking. He gestured, and the auditorium walls became transparent, showing views of the galaxy as it could be. Worlds where crystalline hegemonies grew living cities that sang in harmony with gas-giant atmospheres. Space where collective intelligences built art, projects the size of solar systems. Stellar nurseries where young hives learned to navigate by echolocation in the cosmic microwave background. You create a civilization that becomes more interesting and more capable with every new member that joins it, Dr. Law concluded. Admiral found himself standing without having made a conscious decision to do so. "This is beautiful," he said, and his voice carried a note of wonder that he hadn't felt since his youth. "But how do we get from where we are to where this vision suggests we could be?" Smiled, and his smile contained all the patience of a teacher who had been waiting for exactly this question. "You teach," he said simply. "Every person in this auditorium returns to their people and shares what they've learned, not as conquerors forcing change, but as educators offering new possibilities." The research team stepped forward in unison, their forms flickering between their original appearances and the mathematical concepts they had become. "The human approach to education," Doctor explained, "is based on the principle that learning is most effective when it's voluntary. We don't force understanding. We create conditions where understanding becomes inevitable." "We share stories," Dr. X added, "that help people imagine better possibilities. We ask questions," Dr. Law continued, "that lead people to discover insights on their own." Nodded, and most importantly, we demonstrate that the new approach works better than the old one. We show rather than tell. The auditorium began to transform again, becoming something that was simultaneously a graduation ceremony and a launching platform. Each member of the audience found themselves standing at individual podiums equipped with communication devices that could reach their home worlds instantly. "Your assignment," announced, "is to return home and begin teaching. Start small. Share what you've learned with individuals who are ready to hear it. Help them understand that diversity of thought is a strength, not a weakness. Show them that cooperation produces better results than domination." The communication devices activated, connecting the assembled fleet to every major population center in Council space. But instead of military commands or emergency warnings, the transmissions carried something unprecedented: an invitation to imagine galactic civilization organized around principles of cooperation and mutual respect. Admiral found himself speaking to the Imperial Command, but the words coming out of his mouth weren't military reports. They were descriptions of worlds where species learned from each other instead of conquering each other, where scientific advancement came from collaboration instead of exploitation, where the vast diversity of galactic life was celebrated rather than suppressed. Across the fleet, similar conversations were taking place. Officers and soldiers who had come prepared for war found themselves discussing philosophy with their home governments. Scientists who had expected to study a threat found themselves explaining new approaches to research ethics. Engineers who had planned to analyze weapons found themselves designing systems for cooperation. "The beautiful thing about this approach," observed, addressing the entire assembly while somehow making each person feel like he was speaking directly to them, "is that it's self-reinforcing. Every person who learns to think this way becomes capable of teaching others. Every successful cooperation makes the next cooperation easier. Every time species work together effectively, it demonstrates that the new model works better than the old one." The graduation ceremony continued for hours, but time seemed to flow differently in the impossible auditorium. Conversations developed organically, with beings from different species discovering common ground and shared interests they had never noticed before. Projects emerged spontaneously as groups realized they could combine their unique capabilities to achieve things none of them could accomplish alone. As the event drew to a close, Admiral realized that something fundamental had changed in his thinking. The massive fleet that had assembled to destroy a threat had instead become a diverse group of individuals committed to building something better. "Will we see you again?" he asked as the auditorium began to fade back into normal space. Considered this question seriously. "I'll be wherever teachers are needed," he said finally. "But I don't think you'll need my help for very long. You're all excellent students, and excellent students become excellent teachers." The research team stepped forward one final time, their forms now clearly visible as the hybrid beings they had become, part alien scientist and part human educational philosophy. "Remember," Doctor said, his voice carrying across the dissolving space, Fear is a tool for imagination, not a weapon for control. Diversity is a resource for problem solving, not a problem to be solved, Dr. X added. And education is a gift you give freely, not a privilege you hoard, Dr. Law concluded. The vast auditorium faded, leaving the fleet floating in normal space near where Research Station Omega-7 had once been. But instead of the crystalline structure that had existed there moments before, they found only empty space and a small probe broadcasting a simple message. Thank you for attending graduation. Your real education begins now. Please remember to be kind to each other and never stop learning. Signed, Professor and the Faculty of Applied Human Philosophy. Admiral looked around at his fleet, no longer seeing a military force but a collection of graduates who had work to do. Throughout the ships, beings were already organizing discussion groups, planning collaborative projects, and designing new approaches to problems that had seemed unsolvable under the old paradigms. Set course for home, he ordered, but the word home now seemed to encompass something much larger than the Empire. It included every world where beings were ready to learn that cooperation worked better than conquest, that diversity was strength, and that the most powerful weapon in the galaxy was the simple act of teaching someone to see possibilities they had never imagined. Behind them, in the space where the station had been, reality shimmered with the echo of laughter. Children's laughter, the sound of students who had finally understood a difficult lesson and were eager to share what they had learned with everyone they met. The galaxy was about to discover what happened when a species that had weaponized imagination decided to teach the universe to imagine better things. And in schools and research facilities and government chambers across thousands of worlds, the lesson was beginning.